Hi everyone. I'm sitting here in my apartment, looking at a faded scar on my left temple that most people never notice. It's small, barely visible unless you know where to look, but it represents one of the most devastating moments of my childhood. Today, I'm going to tell you about the day my father beat me unconscious over $50, and how my mother's response broke something in me that took years to repair. My name is Marcus, and this is the hardest story I've ever shared publicly. It's about family violence, about the complex dynamics of abuse, and about how sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us become complicit in our harm. It's also about survival, healing, and learning to break cycles that have existed for generations. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story contains descriptions of physical violence and family trauma. If you're currently in an unsafe situation, please know that there are people who want to help you. I'll include resources in the description below. This isn't just my story, it's the story of millions of children who grow up in homes where violence is normalized, where victims are blamed, and where speaking up often makes things worse instead of better. If any part of this resonates with your own experience, please know that you're not alone, and that healing is possible. Let me take you back to when I was 14 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit with my parents and my younger sister, Keisha. From the outside, we probably looked like a typical working-class family. My dad, Robert, worked construction when he could find steady work. My mom, Angela, cleaned office buildings downtown 3 nights a week and took care of us during the day. But inside our home, there was always an undercurrent of tension, a feeling that one wrong move could set off an explosion. My father had what everyone politely called a temper, but what I now understand was a pattern of abuse that had likely been passed down through generations of men who never learned healthy ways to handle stress, frustration, or their own pain. Growing up in our house was like living in a minefield. You learn to read the signs, the way my father's jaw would tighten when he was frustrated, the particular silence that meant he was building up to an outburst, the careful way my mother would move around him when his mood was dark. My father wasn't violent every day. In fact, there were stretches of time when he could be funny, affectionate, even gentle. He'd take Keisha and me to the park, help me with my homework, tell stories about his own childhood that made us laugh. These good moments made the bad ones even more confusing and devastating, because they proved that he was capable of being the father we needed him to be. But when stress mounted, when work was scarce, when bills were piling up, when he'd been drinking, or sometimes for no reason we could identify, the violence would emerge. It usually started with yelling, progressed to throwing things, and often ended with someone getting hurt. My mother bore the brunt of it for years. I have memories from as young as 5 or 6 of hiding in my bedroom with Keisha while we listened to shouting, crashing sounds, and my mother's tears through the thin walls. The next morning, she'd have new bruises that she'd explain away as clumsiness or accidents, and we'd all pretend that the previous night hadn't happened. As I got older, I started to become a target myself. At first, it was just verbal, criticism about my grades, my friends, my attitude, my appearance. Nothing I did was ever good enough, and everything I said was somehow disrespectful or inappropriate. I learned to stay quiet, to make myself invisible, to avoid giving him any reason to focus his anger on me. But by the time I was 13, the verbal abuse occasionally turned physical. A shove here, a slap there, always followed by explanations about how I'd brought it on myself, how I needed to learn respect, how this was just normal discipline that would help me become a man. My mother's response to these incidents was always the same. She'd tell me that I needed to be more careful about how I spoke to my father, that I should try to understand the pressure he was under, that family loyalty meant supporting each other even when things were difficult. She never explicitly said that the violence was my fault, but her responses made it clear that she believed I had some responsibility for preventing it. By the time I turned 14, I had become an expert at reading my father's moods and adjusting my behavior accordingly. I knew which topics to avoid, which tone of voice to use, how to position my body to appear non-threatening, when to make eye contact and when to look away. I'd learned that asking for money was always risky, even for basic necessities like school supplies or lunch money. My father saw these requests as evidence that I was spoiled or ungrateful, that I didn't understand the value of hard work, that I was trying to take advantage of the family's limited resources. So when my algebra teacher announced that we needed graphing calculators for an upcoming unit, I felt my stomach drop. These calculators cost around $50, money that I knew would be seen as an extravagance in our house, even though it was a required school supply. I spent weeks trying to figure out alternatives. I asked my teacher if there were calculators I could borrow, looked into whether the school had any available for students who couldn't afford their own, researched whether there were cheaper options that would meet the requirements. But ultimately, I was going to need that $50, and I was going to have to ask my parents for it. I chose my moment carefully. My father had been in a relatively good mood for several days. Work had been steady, and he'd even taken us out for pizza the weekend before. I waited until after dinner, when he was relaxed and watching television, to bring up the calculator. I explained the assignment, showed him the teacher's note about the requirement, emphasized that this wasn't optional but necessary for me to complete my coursework. I'd even researched the cheapest option available and found a calculator for exactly $50 at the electronics store downtown. His initial response was what I'd expected: frustration about the expense, complaints about how schools were always asking parents to buy things, grumbling about whether I really needed such an expensive calculator for basic math. But I thought I was navigating it well, staying calm and respectful, providing clear information about why this was necessary. Then he asked why I hadn't mentioned this sooner, why I was waiting until the last minute to tell them about this expense. And that's when I made my mistake. I tried to explain that I had been looking for alternatives, that I'd wanted to see if there were other options before asking them to spend money we didn't have. I thought this would show responsibility and consideration for our family's financial situation. Instead, my father heard it as criticism. He heard me saying that our family was poor, that I was embarrassed about our financial situation, that I thought he wasn't providing adequately for his family. His mood shifted instantly from mild irritation to explosive anger. He started yelling about how he worked every day to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table, how ungrateful kids these days didn't understand what sacrifice meant, how I thought I was too good for the family I was born into. The volume and intensity of his anger escalated quickly, and I could see my mother in the kitchen, her shoulders tensing as she recognized the warning signs. I tried to de-escalate by apologizing, by explaining that I hadn't meant to imply anything negative about our family or his ability to provide. But once my father reached a certain level of anger, rational conversation became impossible. He wasn't hearing my words anymore, he was responding to his own internal narrative about disrespect and ingratitude and challenge to his authority. He stood up from his chair, and I instinctively took a step backward. This movement, my obvious fear and attempt to create distance, seemed to enrage him further. He accused me of acting like he was some kind of monster, of being dramatic and manipulative, of trying to make him look bad in front of the family. When I tried to explain that I was just scared, that I hadn't meant to upset him, he told me that if I was going to act scared, he'd give me something to actually be scared about. And that's when he grabbed the calculator money I'd earned from my part-time job at the corner store, money I'd been saving for weeks, hoping to contribute to the cost of the calculator myself. The $50 was in my wallet, sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it after my shift earlier that day. I'd been so proud of earning that money, of being able to contribute to the cost of my school supplies, of showing my parents that I was responsible and willing to work for what I needed. When my father picked up my wallet and pulled out the bills, I felt a surge of panic that overrode my usual caution. That money represented hours of work, early mornings before school, staying late to clean the store, dealing with difficult customers. It was mine, and I'd earned it fairly. Without thinking, I stepped forward and said that the money was mine, that I'd earned it at my job, that I was planning to use it to help pay for the calculator. I wasn't yelling or being disrespectful, I was just stating facts. But in that moment, with my father already in a rage, any assertion of my rights or autonomy was seen as unacceptable defiance. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just anger, but something colder and more dangerous. He told me that everything in this house belonged to him, including any money I earned, and that if I had a problem with that, I could find somewhere else to live. When I tried to explain that I wasn't challenging his authority, that I just wanted to help pay for my school supplies, he shoved me hard enough that I stumbled backward into the wall. The impact knocked a framed photo off its hook, and the sound of breaking glass seemed to snap something in him. I knew I should have stayed down, should have apologized immediately, should have done whatever it took to de-escalate the situation. But I was 14 years old, scared and hurt and angry, and I made another mistake. I stood up and asked why he was being so mean, why he couldn't just let me use my own money to help pay for something I needed for school. That question, "Why are you being so mean?" was apparently the final straw. What happened next happened fast, but I remember every detail with the kind of brutal clarity that trauma burns into your memory. My father's face changed completely, and I knew I was in real danger. I started to move toward my bedroom, hoping to get away from him, but he grabbed my arm and spun me around. The first hit was a slap across my face that sent me reeling. Before I could recover, he grabbed the front of my shirt and hit me again, this time with his closed fist. The impact made my ears ring and filled my mouth with the metallic taste of blood. I tried to protect myself, raising my arms to shield my face, but this seemed to make him angrier. He accused me of fighting back, of showing him disrespect, of thinking I was tough enough to stand up to him. Each accusation was punctuated by another blow, to my ribs, my stomach, my back. I fell to the floor, and I thought that would be the end of it. Usually, once someone was down, my father would stop and walk away. But this time was different. This time, he kept hitting me, kicking me, telling me that he was going to teach me a lesson I'd never forget. I could hear my mother screaming at him to stop, could hear my sister crying from somewhere in the apartment, but it all seemed to be coming from very far away. My vision was getting blurry, and the pain was becoming distant and strange. I remember thinking that this couldn't really be happening, that my father couldn't really be hurting me this badly over $50 and a graphing calculator. The last thing I remember clearly was trying to crawl toward my bedroom, hoping to get away from him, and feeling his foot connect with my head. Then everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on my bed with my mother sitting beside me, holding a wet washcloth to my forehead. My whole body hurt in ways I'd never experienced before, and when I tried to sit up, waves of nausea and dizziness made me lie back down immediately. My mother was crying quietly, dabbing at the cuts on my face with the washcloth. She kept saying she was sorry, that everything was going to be okay, that I needed to stay still and rest. But she wouldn't look directly at me, and there was something in her voice that made me more scared than the physical pain. I asked her what had happened, even though I remembered most of it. I think I was hoping she would say that my father had gone too far, that this level of violence was unacceptable, that she was going to do something to make sure it never happened again. I was hoping she would validate my experience and assure me that none of this was normal or okay. Instead, she told me that there had been a misunderstanding, that my father had been under a lot of stress, that these things happened in families sometimes. She said that she'd talked to him and that he felt bad about how things had escalated, but that I needed to understand why he'd gotten so upset. According to my mother, I had been disrespectful and defiant. I had challenged my father's authority in his own home. I had made him feel like I didn't appreciate everything he did for our family. She explained that men like my father, who worked hard and carried the weight of supporting a family, sometimes reacted strongly when they felt unappreciated or disrespected. The more she talked, the more I realized that she wasn't going to acknowledge the severity of what had happened. She wasn't going to call it abuse or violence. She wasn't going to protect me from it happening again. Instead, she was going to frame it as a family conflict that had gotten out of hand, something that could be prevented in the future if I just learned to be more careful about how I interacted with my father. After my mother finished explaining why the beating had happened, she told me that my father was feeling bad about how things had gone. She said he was worried about me, that he'd been pacing around the apartment asking if I was okay, that he wanted to make sure our family could move past this incident. Then she said the words that broke something fundamental inside me. She told me that when I felt well enough, I needed to apologize to my father for being disrespectful, for challenging his authority, for creating the situation that had led to the violence. I stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. I was lying in bed with a concussion, multiple bruises, a split lip, and what I later learned was a cracked rib, and she was telling me that I owed my attacker an apology. When I tried to protest, when I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I'd just asked about using my own money for a school supply, she cut me off. She told me that this was about more than the specific incident, that this was about respect and family harmony and learning to live peacefully together. She explained that my father had a difficult job, that he carried a lot of responsibility, that he needed to feel respected and appreciated in his own home. She said that sometimes I could be thoughtless or inconsiderate without meaning to be, and that I needed to be more aware of how my words and actions affected other people. Most devastatingly, she told me that if I really cared about our family, if I wanted to prevent future incidents like this one, I would take responsibility for my part in what had happened and make an effort to rebuild the relationship with my father. The message was clear: the violence was my fault, the responsibility for preventing future violence was mine, and my father's feelings were more important than my physical safety. 3 days later, when I could walk without significant pain and the swelling in my face had gone down enough that I could speak clearly, my mother told me it was time to have a conversation with my father. She'd set up what she called a family meeting to clear the air and move forward. I knew what this meant. I was going to be expected to apologize for being beaten unconscious, to take responsibility for being a victim of violence, to prioritize my father's emotional comfort over my own physical safety and psychological well-being. I tried one more time to make my mother understand how wrong this was. I told her that I hadn't done anything that justified being beaten. I explained that asking about using my own money for a school supply wasn't disrespectful or defiant. I pointed out that I could have been seriously injured or killed, that normal families don't handle conflicts with violence. But my mother's response made it clear that she'd already decided how this was going to go. She told me that everyone makes mistakes, that my father had already acknowledged that he'd lost his temper, and that the important thing now was for our family to heal and move forward together. She said that holding grudges wouldn't help anyone, that I needed to decide whether I wanted to be part of the solution or part of the problem. She reminded me that this was my family, the only family I had, and that families stick together through difficult times. The implicit threat was clear: if I didn't participate in this performance of reconciliation, if I didn't accept responsibility for being abused, I would be seen as the problem, the one causing continued conflict and preventing the family from healing. So I agreed to the family meeting, not because I believed I owed my father an apology, but because I was 14 years old with nowhere else to go and no other options for safety or support. The family meeting took place in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. My father sat in his usual chair, my mother sat on the couch, and I sat across from them both, still feeling pain in my ribs every time I took a deep breath. My mother started by talking about how much she loved our family, how important it was for us to be able to work through conflicts together, how everyone needed to take responsibility for their part in what had happened. She spoke as if the violence had been a mutual conflict rather than a one-sided assault. Then my father spoke. He said that he'd lost his temper, that he'd let his stress get the better of him, that he wished things hadn't escalated the way they had. But even his apology was conditional and blame-shifting. He talked about how frustrated he'd been with work, how worried he was about money, how difficult it was when he felt unappreciated by his own family. He said that he'd been hurt by what he perceived as my disrespect, that he'd felt like I was ungrateful for everything he did to support our family. He explained that his own father had been much harsher with him, that he was actually trying to be easier on me than his father had been on him. Then it was my turn. With both my parents looking at me expectantly, I delivered the apology my mother had demanded. I said that I was sorry for being disrespectful, that I hadn't meant to make my father feel unappreciated, that I understood why he'd gotten upset. The words felt like poison in my mouth. Every syllable was a betrayal of my own experience, my own truth, my own worth. I was apologizing for being beaten unconscious, taking responsibility for violence that had been inflicted on me, participating in a narrative that made me the perpetrator rather than the victim. My father accepted my apology graciously, telling me that he was proud of me for taking responsibility, that this showed I was growing up and learning important lessons about respect and family loyalty. My mother smiled and talked about how good it felt to have our family back together, how proud she was that we could work through this difficult time. And then we all pretended that everything was normal again. In the days and weeks following the forced apology, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. Everyone in my family acted as if the problem had been solved, as if the family meeting had magically erased the trauma of being beaten unconscious and then blamed for it. My father was actually nicer to me than he'd been in months. He asked about school, offered to help with homework, even gave me the $50 for the graphing calculator without any additional conflict. It was as if the violence had never happened, as if my forced apology had reset our relationship to some mythical state of harmony. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't pretend that being beaten unconscious was normal family conflict. I couldn't unsee my mother's willingness to prioritize my father's feelings over my safety. I couldn't unhear my own voice apologizing for being a victim of violence. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly, but the psychological damage was much more severe and long-lasting. I'd learned that I couldn't count on my mother to protect me, that violence would be redefined as discipline or conflict, that my role in the family was to absorb abuse and then take responsibility for it. I became hypervigilant about my behavior around my father, constantly monitoring my tone of voice, my facial expressions, my body language for anything that might be interpreted as disrespectful. I stopped expressing opinions, stopped asking for things I needed, stopped existing as anything other than a compliant presence in the house. At school, I struggled to concentrate on my studies. The graphing calculator that had started the whole incident sat in my backpack as a constant reminder of what could happen when I asserted any kind of autonomy or need. I'd wake up with nightmares about being trapped, about being hurt, about calling for help and having no one respond. Teachers occasionally asked if I was okay, noticed the changes in my behavior and academic performance. But I'd learned that telling the truth about what happened at home only made things worse, so I developed elaborate lies about being tired, stressed about grades, dealing with typical teenage problems. One of the most devastating aspects of this experience was how it isolated me from potential sources of help and support. My mother's insistence that I was partially responsible for the violence made it impossible for me to seek help from adults who might have intervened. How could I tell a teacher or counselor that my father had beaten me unconscious when my own mother believed I'd brought it on myself? How could I report abuse when the other victim in the house was actively participating in the cover-up? The forced apology had been particularly damaging because it made me complicit in the narrative that justified the violence. I'd literally said the words that took responsibility for being abused, which made it much harder to later claim that I was an innocent victim of unprovoked violence. Friends at school started to notice that I was withdrawn and anxious, but I couldn't explain what was happening without revealing family secrets that I'd been taught to keep. The isolation became complete. I was living with people who had hurt me and then convinced me I was responsible for being hurt, and I couldn't tell anyone else what was really happening. Over the following months, I learned the unspoken rules that governed our family system. The most important rule was that my father's emotions and comfort were the top priority for everyone else in the house. If he was stressed, we all had to adjust our behavior to accommodate his stress. The second rule was that incidents of violence were never to be discussed outside the family. These events were treated as temporary aberrations rather than patterns. The third rule was that victims of violence bore some responsibility for preventing future violence. If someone got hurt, they needed to examine their own behavior to understand how they'd contributed to the conflict. The fourth rule was that family loyalty meant protecting the family's reputation above individual safety or well-being. Seeking outside help was seen as betrayal, as damaging the family unit for selfish reasons. These rules created a closed system where abuse could continue indefinitely without outside intervention or accountability. They made it impossible for victims to seek help without being seen as traitors to the family. I internalized these rules completely. They became the lens through which I interpreted not just my own family experiences, but relationships in general. I learned to prioritize other people's comfort over my own safety, to take responsibility for other people's emotional reactions. Unfortunately, the beating over the $50 wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a new phase in our family's dysfunction, where violence became a more regular tool for maintaining control and hierarchy. My father seemed to have learned that he could hurt me severely and face no consequences as long as my mother framed it as discipline or family conflict. The family meeting and forced apology seemed to have convinced him that the violence was actually beneficial. Over the next 2 years, there were several more incidents of serious violence, each one followed by the same pattern of my mother reframing the abuse as a learning experience and demanding that I take responsibility for being hurt. Each incident followed the same script: violence, reframing, blame shifting, forced reconciliation. Each time, I participated in the performance because I didn't know what else to do, because I had nowhere else to go. The cumulative effect was devastating. I learned to see myself as fundamentally flawed, as someone whose natural responses were wrong and dangerous. I learned to distrust my own perceptions and emotions. I learned that my safety and well-being were less important than maintaining family harmony. The turning point came during my senior year of high school when I finally found an adult who was willing to see through the family narrative and respond to what was actually happening. Mrs. Henderson was my English teacher, and she'd been watching my behavior with increasing concern throughout the semester. I was clearly intelligent and capable, but I was withdrawn, anxious, and seemed to live in constant fear of making mistakes. I rarely spoke in class, and when I did, I was overly apologetic and deferential. One day, she asked me to stay after class to discuss an essay I'd written about family traditions. In the essay, I described some of the learning experiences my father had provided, using the language my mother had taught me to reframe violence as discipline and growth opportunities. Mrs. Henderson looked at me for a long moment after reading the essay, and then asked if I was safe at home. The directness of her question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I almost told her the truth. But then I remembered all the reasons why I couldn't tell: the family loyalty rules, the responsibility I bore for preventing violence, the certainty that talking to outsiders would only make things worse. So I gave her the standard response about how all families have conflicts, how my parents were just trying to help me become a better person, how I was learning important lessons about respect and responsibility. Mrs. Henderson didn't accept this explanation. She told me that what I'd described in my essay sounded like abuse, not discipline. She said that children should never be responsible for preventing adults from becoming violent, that family conflicts could be resolved without anyone getting hurt, that I deserved to feel safe in my own home. For the first time in years, an adult was telling me that my experience of violence was unacceptable, that I wasn't responsible for being hurt, that my family's way of handling conflict wasn't normal or healthy. Mrs. Henderson's validation of my experience was the beginning of a long journey toward understanding what had really happened to me and learning to see myself as a victim rather than a perpetrator of family conflict. She connected me with the school counselor, Mr. Rodriguez, who helped me understand the dynamics of family violence and the psychological tactics that abusers use to maintain control. He explained how victims are often convinced that they're responsible for their own abuse, how family members can become complicit in maintaining abusive systems, how isolation and secrecy allow violence to continue unchallenged. Most importantly, he helped me understand that my mother's response to the violence wasn't protective or loving, it was actually a form of abuse itself. By forcing me to take responsibility for being beaten, by demanding that I apologize for being hurt, by prioritizing my father's feelings over my safety, she'd been participating in and enabling the violence rather than protecting me from it. This realization was both liberating and devastating. It meant that I wasn't crazy or oversensitive for feeling traumatized by what had happened. It meant that my instincts about the wrongness of the situation had been correct all along. But it also meant that both of my parents had failed me in fundamental ways, that the family I'd been trying so hard to preserve wasn't worth preserving. With the support of Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Rodriguez, I started making plans to leave home after graduation. I applied for college scholarships, researched financial aid options, and began the process of separating my identity from my family's expectations and demands. This wasn't easy. My parents had raised me to believe that family loyalty was the highest virtue, that children owed their parents unconditional love and support regardless of how they were treated. Learning to prioritize my own safety and well-being over family harmony felt like betrayal, even though I intellectually understood that it was necessary. During the spring of my senior year, about 6 months before I was planning to leave for college, there was one final incident that crystallized everything I'd learned about my family's dysfunction. My father had been drinking more heavily than usual due to work stress, and the house had been tense for weeks. One evening, he started an argument with my mother about money, accusing her of spending too much on groceries, questioning every purchase she'd made that week. I watched this interaction with new eyes, seeing clearly how my father used anger and intimidation to control everyone around him, how my mother immediately became apologetic and defensive, how the entire family dynamic shifted to accommodate his emotional volatility. When the argument escalated and my father raised his hand to my mother, I did something I'd never done before. I stepped between them and told him to stop. The look of shock on his face quickly turned to rage. He accused me of being disrespectful, of interfering in adult business, of thinking I was man enough to challenge him in his own house. But this time, I didn't back down. I told him that hitting people was wrong, that family members shouldn't hurt each other, that I wasn't going to watch him hurt my mother or anyone else anymore. I said that I was tired of pretending that violence was normal, tired of apologizing for being hurt, tired of living in fear in my own home. My father's response was predictable. He tried to hit me. But I was bigger and stronger than I'd been at 14, and I was prepared for his attack. I blocked his punch and pushed him away from me, telling him that I wasn't going to let him hurt me anymore. The physical confrontation lasted only a few moments, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, I'd refused to accept violence, refused to participate in the cycle of abuse and forced reconciliation, refused to prioritize my father's feelings over my own safety. My mother's response to this incident was perhaps the most revealing of all. Instead of being relieved that someone had finally stood up to my father's violence, instead of supporting my refusal to accept abuse, she was furious with me for disrupting the family dynamic. She accused me of making things worse, of escalating a situation that could have been resolved peacefully, of being just as violent and problematic as my father. She said that I'd learned nothing from all the lessons my father had tried to teach me about respect and family loyalty. Most devastatingly, she told me that if I couldn't learn to get along with my father, if I was going to continue causing problems and creating conflict, then maybe it would be better for everyone if I found somewhere else to live. This response confirmed everything I'd learned about my family's dysfunction. My mother wasn't interested in stopping the violence, she was interested in maintaining a system where everyone accommodated my father's abusive behavior. My refusal to participate in that system made me the problem, not the person who had been committing acts of violence for years. I realized that my mother had never been protecting me by forcing me to apologize for being beaten. She'd been protecting the family system that allowed my father to abuse us without consequences. She'd been prioritizing the stability of her marriage over the safety and well-being of her children. This understanding was both heartbreaking and empowering. It broke my heart to realize that my mother had chosen to sacrifice me to maintain her relationship with an abusive man. But it also empowered me to stop seeking her approval or protection, to stop hoping that she would eventually stand up for me, to stop believing that I was responsible for fixing our family's problems. That summer, I moved out of my family's apartment and into a small room I rented near the community college. It wasn't much, but it was the first space that had ever been truly mine. My parents' response was predictable. My father seemed relieved to have me gone. My mother was hurt and angry, convinced that I was abandoning the family for selfish reasons, unable to understand why I couldn't just learn to get along with my father. Neither of them ever acknowledged that the violence had been wrong, that forcing me to apologize for being beaten had been damaging. They maintained the narrative that I was the problem, that I'd been ungrateful and disrespectful. Moving out was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For the first time in my life, I could express opinions without fear of violent retaliation. I could exist as a full human being rather than as someone whose primary responsibility was to avoid triggering an abuser. The process of healing from childhood abuse has been long and complicated, requiring years of therapy, self-reflection, and conscious effort to unlearn the toxic lessons I'd internalized about relationships, conflict, and my own worth. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was learning to see my mother's behavior clearly. For years, I'd thought of her as a fellow victim. It took time to understand that her demand that I apologize for being beaten was actually a form of psychological abuse, that her refusal to protect me was a choice rather than an inevitability. Through therapy, I've learned about the complex dynamics of family violence, about how abuse is maintained through systems of control, secrecy, and blame shifting. I've come to understand that my experience wasn't unique. Millions of children grow up in homes where violence is normalized, where victims are blamed for their own abuse. I've also learned that healing is possible, that the damage done by childhood abuse can be addressed and overcome, that it's possible to build healthy relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than fear and control. One of my greatest fears as a young adult was that I would repeat the patterns I'd grown up with. The statistics about cycles of violence are sobering, and I knew that my childhood experiences had created risk factors that I needed to actively address. This awareness led me to be very intentional about my relationships and my own emotional development. I committed to therapy, worked on understanding my triggers and trauma responses, and learned healthy ways to handle conflict and stress. When I eventually got married and had children of my own, I was determined to create a family environment completely different from what I'd experienced. My wife and I have built our relationship on principles of mutual respect, open communication, and shared responsibility for each other's well-being. Most importantly, we've committed to protecting our children from violence in all its forms. Our children are growing up in an environment where they feel safe to express themselves, where their feelings and experiences are validated, where they're taught that they deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. Even now, more than 20 years after that night when my father beat me unconscious over $50, I still live with the impact of that experience. The physical scars healed long ago, but the psychological effects of being abused and then blamed for the abuse have required ongoing attention and care. I still sometimes struggle with self-doubt and perfectionism, still sometimes catch myself taking responsibility for other people's emotional reactions. These are the lasting effects of being taught that my natural responses were wrong and dangerous. But I've also developed reserves of strength and resilience that I might never have discovered otherwise. I've learned to recognize the warning signs of abusive behavior and to remove myself from unhealthy situations before they escalate. Most importantly, I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how well I can avoid triggering other people's anger, that healthy relationships don't require constant vigilance and self-censorship, that it's possible to be loved for who you are rather than for how well you perform the role of the perfect victim. If you're watching this video because you recognize elements of your own story in mine, I want you to know that you're not alone and that what happened to you wasn't your fault. Children are never responsible for adult decisions to commit acts of violence, regardless of what they might have said or done to trigger that violence. If you were forced to apologize for being abused, if you were told that you brought violence on yourself, please know that those messages were wrong. You were the victim, not the perpetrator. You deserved protection, not blame. Healing from this kind of childhood trauma is possible, but it often requires professional help and a willingness to challenge the narratives about family, loyalty, and responsibility that you may have been taught to accept. It's okay to prioritize your own safety and well-being over family harmony. You have the right to be treated with respect and kindness. You have the right to feel safe in your own home. These aren't privileges that you have to earn through perfect behavior, they're basic human rights that you deserve simply by existing. If you're a parent or family member who recognizes yourself in this story, please understand the devastating impact of forcing children to take responsibility for being abused. When you tell a child that they provoked violence, when you demand that they apologize for being hurt, you're not protecting your family, you're perpetuating cycles of abuse. If there's violence in your home, the solution isn't to teach the victims how to avoid triggering it, the solution is to stop the violence. This may require difficult choices, but protecting children from harm should always be the priority. If you've made mistakes in how you've handled family violence in the past, it's never too late to acknowledge those mistakes and work to repair the damage. One of the reasons I decided to share this story publicly is because silence about family violence serves no one except the perpetrators. When we don't talk about these experiences, we leave victims feeling isolated and alone. Speaking out about abuse is always risky, but it can also be incredibly healing and empowering, both for the person speaking out and for others who hear their story. Every time someone breaks the silence about family violence, it becomes easier for other victims to recognize their own experiences, to understand that they're not alone, to believe that healing and safety are possible. I've been amazed by the response I've received since I started talking more openly about my childhood experiences. So many people have shared their own stories of being abused and blamed, of being forced to apologize for being hurt. These conversations have been difficult but also incredibly valuable. They've helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique, and that there's a real need for more honest discussion about family violence and its long-term effects. If you or someone you know is currently experiencing family violence, please know that there are people who want to help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-799-7233 provides support and resources for anyone dealing with abuse, including children and teenagers who are being hurt by family members. Many communities also have local organizations that specialize in helping families affected by violence. School counselors, teachers, and healthcare providers are also trained to recognize signs of abuse and can help connect families with appropriate resources. If you're a survivor of childhood abuse, therapy can be incredibly helpful for processing trauma and learning healthier relationship patterns. Many therapists specialize in working with survivors of family violence. It's important to remember that healing is possible, even from severe childhood trauma. The human capacity for resilience is remarkable, and with appropriate support and treatment, survivors can go on to live fulfilling lives and build healthy relationships. Recovery isn't always linear, but it is possible to break cycles of violence, to learn to trust your own perceptions and feelings, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear and control. That $50 that started everything, it seems so small now, so insignificant. But it represented something much larger, a child's attempt to take responsibility for his own needs, to contribute to his family's well-being, to exercise basic autonomy in an environment where autonomy was seen as threat. The violence that followed wasn't really about money or disrespect or family hierarchy. It was about control, about maintaining a system where one person's emotions and comfort mattered more than everyone else's safety and well-being. The forced apology that came after wasn't about reconciliation or family healing. It was about ensuring that the victim would continue to participate in a system that blamed them for their own abuse, that prioritized the abuser's feelings over the victim's trauma. But this story isn't just about violence and blame and broken family systems. It's also about survival, about finding the strength to recognize abuse even when everyone around you insists it's normal, about learning to trust your own perceptions even when you're told they're wrong. It's about the power of having even one adult believe you, validate your experience, and help you understand that you deserve better. It's about the possibility of healing, of breaking generational cycles, of creating something different for yourself and your own family. If you're currently living through something similar to what I experienced, please hold on to hope. Your current situation isn't permanent. You have more strength than you realize. There are people who will believe you and support you. Your future can be completely different from your present. The scar on my temple has faded over the years, but I'll never forget what it represents. It reminds me of how far I've come, of what I've survived, of the importance of speaking out about experiences that many people prefer to keep hidden. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing survivors. Thank you for working to create a world where children are protected rather than blamed, where families are safe rather than violent, where love means safety rather than fear. If this video has been helpful to you, please share it with others who might benefit from hearing this message. And please, if you're in an unsafe situation, reach out for help. You deserve to be protected. You deserve to be believed.